Some people spend years waiting for a phone call that never comes. Others wait for an apology that was never going to be spoken. But sometimes the hardest thing to accept is that the person we're waiting for has already left the story while we're still reading the same chapter over and over again. 3 years after the end of a relationship Claire once believed would last forever, she sat alone in her apartment with a single sheet of paper in front of her. By sunrise, she would write the most important letter of her life, a letter filled with memories, questions, regrets, gratitude, heartbreak, and a love she had carried far longer than anyone knew. She folded it carefully, placed it inside an envelope, wrote his name across the front, and then she never sent it. For 3 years, that letter remained hidden in a wooden box beneath her bed. Through changing seasons, birthdays, holidays, and ordinary afternoons, it stayed there untouched, waiting. Some people keep old photographs. Some keep gifts. She kept a letter, not because she believed it would bring him back, not because she thought it would change the past, but because letting go of it felt like letting go of a part of herself. And for a very long time, she wasn't ready to do that. Claire Matthews was 32 years old when she wrote the letter. She lived in Charleston, South Carolina, in a small apartment overlooking streets she had once wandered hand in hand with the man she thought she would marry. To friends and co-workers, Claire appeared strong, sewed up for work. She laughed at the right moments. She attended family gatherings. She answered texts. She smiled in photographs. But there are some heartbreaks that happen quietly. Some losses don't announce themselves to the world. They settle into the spaces between conversations and remain there for years. What made Claire's story different wasn't simply that she had lost someone she loved. Millions of people experience heartbreak. Relationships end every day. People move on. Life continues. What made her story remarkable was the question she carried long after the relationship ended. A question that followed her into every new season of her life. A question she could never fully answer no matter how many times she replayed the memories. Why had everything fallen apart when they had loved each other so deeply? The relationship had ended without the closure she desperately wanted. No final explanation that made sense. No dramatic confrontation. No betrayal she could point to and understand. Just silence. The kind of silence that leaves room for endless possibilities. The kind that convinces you there must be something you missed, something you could have fixed, something you should have said. And so Claire spent years carrying conversations in her mind that never happened. She imagined what she would say if she ever saw him again. She imagined the questions she would ask. She imagined the answers she hoped to hear. Then one evening, after years of holding everything inside, she sat down and began writing. What started as a few sentences became pages, then more pages. Every memory she couldn't forget, every disappointment she had hidden, every moment she wished she could relive one last time. It all poured onto paper. By the time she finished, she believed she had finally written the words that would give her peace. She thought the letter was for him. She thought mailing it would finally set her free. She was wrong. Because the greatest discovery of her life wasn't waiting inside his response. It was waiting inside the letter itself. And before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happened between Claire and the man she loved? Why did she spend years unable to move forward? And what did she discover on the morning she almost mailed the letter that changed everything she believed about heartbreak, forgiveness, and closure? The answers would take her back through years of memories, across thousands of miles, through moments of joy and moments of devastating loss. By the time Claire finally understood the truth, everything she thought she wanted had changed, and the letter she believed was meant for someone else would become the very thing that saved her. At 32 years old, Emily lived alone in Charleston, South Carolina, in an apartment that felt much larger than it actually was. The silence inside it had become familiar, not comforting, but familiar. Every room carried traces of a life she had imagined differently. There were books she planned to read with someone, restaurants she intended to visit with someone, dreams she once assumed would be shared with someone. Instead, she found herself eating dinner alone more nights than she cared to admit, falling asleep beside an empty pillow, and waking up each morning to a life that looked nothing like the one she had spent years building in her mind. The people closest to Emily described her as thoughtful. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered small details about people's lives. She sent birthday cards. She checked in when friends were struggling. She was the type of person who carried other people's pain without ever talking much about her own. But beneath that calm exterior was a woman who had spent years questioning herself, questioning her choices, questioning whether she had somehow ruined the most important relationship of her life. Because 6 years earlier, Emily had met a man named Ryan Brooks, and from the moment he entered her world, nothing felt quite the same again. Ryan was 35 years old when their story began. He was a photographer whose work often took him to places most people only saw in magazines: mountain towns, coastal villages, busy city streets at sunrise, remote landscapes hidden far from crowded highways. He had a way of seeing beauty where others overlooked it. At least that's what Emily thought when she first met him. Ryan carried himself with an easy confidence that drew people in. He was charming without appearing to try, funny without needing attention, adventurous without seeming reckless. The kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with new friends by the end of the night. Yet there was another side of Ryan that Emily wouldn't fully understand until much later. He could talk for hours about places he'd visited, photographs he'd taken, and dreams he hoped to pursue someday. But when conversations turned toward his emotions, something changed. Walls appeared where openness had once seemed possible. Questions were met with half answers. Vulnerability became avoidance, and although Emily recognized these moments early in their relationship, she convinced herself they weren't important. After all, nobody is perfect. Everyone carries scars. Everyone has fears. Love, she believed, meant accepting those imperfections. For a long time, that's exactly what she did. The strange thing about heartbreak is that when people hear a relationship ended, they often assume there must have been a dramatic reason, a betrayal, a lie, a major conflict, something obvious. Something people can point to and say, that's why it happened. But Emily's story wasn't that simple. That's what made it so difficult to leave behind. Because years after Ryan walked away, she still couldn't identify the exact moment everything changed. There was no single argument she could blame. No clear turning point, just a slow unraveling that seemed impossible to stop once it began. And perhaps that's why the questions refused to leave her alone. Why did their love story end when both of them once seemed so certain about the future? What was hidden inside the letter Emily spent years carrying? And could letting go of the past become the very thing that finally saved her life from being defined by it? Those questions followed Emily everywhere, into grocery stores, into quiet evenings, into long drives across Charleston streets she used to travel with Ryan. Sometimes she thought she was making progress. Sometimes entire weeks passed without thinking about him. Then a song would play unexpectedly. A familiar scent would drift through the air. An old photograph would appear while scrolling through her phone. And suddenly she was back in the same emotional place she thought she'd already escaped. The hardest part wasn't missing Ryan. Not anymore. The hardest part was missing the future she once believed they would have together. Because grief isn't always about losing a person. Sometimes it's about losing a possibility, a version of tomorrow that never arrived. For years, Emily believed closure existed somewhere outside herself. She imagined a conversation that would finally explain everything. She imagined hearing words that would make the pain make sense. She imagined receiving answers that would allow her to move forward without looking back. Like so many people struggling with heartbreak, she believed peace was waiting on the other side of someone else's response. What Emily didn't know was that her search for closure was leading her somewhere entirely different. Most people think closure comes from another person. Emily would discover something very different. But before she could learn that lesson, she would have to revisit the beginning. Back to a season of her life when hope felt limitless, when the future seemed bright, and when a chance encounter with a photographer named Ryan Brooks would begin a love story she never imagined could end. Long before Ryan Brooks became the person whose memory would occupy so much space in her life, Emily Carter had become comfortable with solitude. Not because she preferred being alone, but because experience had taught her that relying too heavily on other people often ended in disappointment. By the time she reached her early 30s, she had built a life that looked successful from the outside. She had steady work, a comfortable apartment in Charleston, and a small circle of friends who genuinely cared about her. She paid her bills on time. She traveled occasionally. She celebrated birthdays and holidays. She smiled in photographs. To most people, Emily seemed like someone who had everything under control, yet there were quiet moments, usually late at night, when the silence inside her apartment felt louder than it should. Moments when she would glance around the room and realize there was nobody to share the ordinary details of her day with. Nobody asking how work went. Nobody waiting to hear about a frustrating meeting or a funny conversation. Nobody beside her on the couch while she watched movies she barely paid attention to. Working remotely gave Emily freedom, but it also magnified her loneliness in ways she rarely admitted. Days often passed with minimal human interaction. Her mornings began with coffee and emails. Her afternoons disappeared into meetings and deadlines. Her evenings arrived quietly. Sometimes she would take long walks through Charleston simply to be around other people. She would sit on park benches or visit local cafes and watch life unfold around her. Couples holding hands, families laughing together, elderly spouses walking slowly beside one another after decades of companionship. She wasn't jealous exactly. She was hopeful, or at least she tried to be. Deep down, she wanted what they had. Not perfection, not a fairy tale, just someone who would choose her every day. The truth was that Emily's fear of vulnerability had been building long before Ryan entered the picture. Earlier relationships had left scars she rarely discussed. There had been promises that weren't kept, commitments that disappeared, people who seemed invested until things became complicated. Each disappointment taught her the same lesson: protect your heart, lower your expectations, don't trust too quickly, don't need too much. Over time, those lessons became habits. Habits became walls, and those walls kept her safe, but they also kept people at a distance. Emily convinced herself she was independent, strong, self-sufficient. Yet underneath that strength was a longing she couldn't ignore. She wanted to be fully known by someone, fully accepted, fully chosen. What made her loneliness particularly difficult was that she wasn't searching for grand romance. She wasn't dreaming about extravagant gestures or perfect moments. She wanted something far simpler. She wanted consistency. She wanted honesty. She wanted the comfort of knowing someone would still be there tomorrow. Looking back years later, Emily would realize that her greatest desire wasn't love itself. It was certainty. The certainty that someone would stay. And perhaps that's why Ryan Brooks affected her so deeply when he appeared. At first, their meeting seemed insignificant. One of those ordinary moments people forget almost immediately. It happened on a mild afternoon at a small independent coffee shop tucked away on a Charleston side street. Emily had gone there to work for a few hours after spending the morning staring at the same unfinished project in her apartment. The cafe was busy enough to feel lively but quiet enough to concentrate. She ordered her usual drink, found a seat near a window, and opened the novel she'd been reading whenever work became overwhelming. About 20 minutes later, a man approached her table carrying a book. "Excuse me," he said. "I think that's the best novel I've read all year." Emily looked up. The man smiled and held up the exact same book. For a second, she laughed. It was unexpected, simple, completely ordinary, yet neither of them walked away. What started as a brief comment about a novel turned into a conversation about favorite authors, then travel, then photography, then life. Minutes stretched into hours without either of them noticing. The easy rhythm of the conversation surprised Emily. There was no awkwardness, no forced small talk, no pressure. Just two strangers discovering they enjoyed talking to each other. That stranger was Ryan Brooks. By the time they finally left the cafe, the afternoon had faded into evening. They walked together through Charleston streets lined with historic buildings and glowing streetlights. The conversation continued as naturally as it had begun. Ryan told stories about photographing coastal towns and mountain landscapes. Emily shared memories from childhood and dreams she rarely discussed with anyone. Neither person seemed eager for the evening to end. Over the following weeks, those conversations became a regular part of their lives. One coffee turned into several. Several became dinner. Dinner became long walks along the waterfront. The waterfront became sunset conversations that lasted until neither wanted to say goodnight. They discovered they shared the same dry sense of humor. They laughed at things other people found unremarkable. They talked about books, family, fears, ambitions, and memories. They exchanged messages throughout the day. Sometimes those conversations continued late into the night. There was an ease between them that Emily hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in a very long time, lowering her guard felt natural. The photographs from that period still existed years later. Smiling faces, weekend adventures, ocean sunsets painted in shades of gold and orange, text messages filled with excitement, tiny moments that felt insignificant at the time, but eventually became precious memories. Every picture captured the same thing: possibility. For Emily, it felt as though life was finally moving in the direction she had always hoped. The loneliness that once followed her everywhere began to fade. The future felt larger, brighter, more certain. She started imagining things she had spent years trying not to imagine: shared holidays, shared homes, shared dreams. Most importantly, she started imagining permanence. Looking back, Emily would later wonder whether she fell in love with Ryan himself or with the hope he represented. Maybe it was both. Maybe that's what love often is: a connection between who someone is and who we believe they might become. Whatever the reason, one thing became impossible to deny. Within weeks, Emily was falling in love. Ryan was too, or so she believed. If someone had asked Emily Carter during the first year of her relationship with Ryan Brooks whether she believed she had found the person she would spend the rest of her life with, she wouldn't have hesitated. The answer would have come easily, not because Ryan made grand promises or dramatic declarations, but because of the countless small moments that slowly built her confidence in what they were creating together. Love rarely arrives all at once. It doesn't usually announce itself with certainty. More often, it grows quietly through routines, habits, shared experiences, and ordinary days that somehow become extraordinary simply because of who you're sharing them with. That was what happened to Emily. Long before she ever thought the words forever, she began feeling them. The relationship developed naturally. There was no rush, no pressure, just a growing sense that they fit into each other's lives in a way that felt effortless. Weekend road trips became one of their favorite traditions. Sometimes they planned destinations. Other times they simply chose a direction and drove. Ryan would stop to photograph old buildings, quiet beaches, forgotten roads, and unexpected landscapes. Emily would laugh as he searched for the perfect angle, pretending to be impatient even though she secretly loved watching him work. Those trips often became some of their happiest memories. Hours spent talking about everything and nothing: dreams for the future, childhood stories, fears they rarely shared with anyone else. As the months passed, their lives became increasingly intertwined. There were evenings spent cooking dinner together, while music played softly in the background. Ryan would tease Emily about her inability to follow recipes exactly. Emily would laugh at Ryan's tendency to leave cabinet doors open. What seemed insignificant at the time would later become the memories she treasured most: dancing barefoot in the kitchen while waiting for pasta to boil, sitting on the floor eating takeout after long workdays, watching storms roll in from the coast, falling asleep on the couch halfway through movies they never finished. Those moments didn't feel remarkable while they were happening, yet they became the foundation of everything Emily believed their future would be. The beach quickly became another important part of their story. Living near the coast meant there were endless opportunities to escape the demands of everyday life. Some evenings they walked for miles along the shoreline, while the sun disappeared beneath the horizon. Other times they sat quietly, listening to waves crash against the sand. Ryan often brought his camera. Emily often brought books. Neither seemed to mind the silence when it appeared. There was comfort in simply being together. Looking back years later, Emily would remember those evenings with extraordinary clarity. The colors of the sky, the sound of the water, the feeling that life had finally settled into something safe and certain. Then came the introductions. Friends met friends. Families met families. Holiday gatherings became shared events instead of separate obligations. Emily still remembered the first time Ryan met her parents. She had spent days worrying unnecessarily. Ryan's natural charm won everyone over within minutes. He laughed with her father, helped her mother clear dishes after dinner, listened attentively to family stories he'd never heard before. On the drive home that night, Emily remembered feeling a quiet sense of relief. Watching the people she loved embrace the man she loved felt significant, like another step towards something permanent. Ryan's family welcomed Emily just as warmly. She attended birthdays, celebrations, and family dinners. She learned names, traditions, and stories. Gradually, she stopped feeling like a guest and started feeling like she belonged. It wasn't difficult to imagine a future that included all of them. In fact, it became increasingly difficult to imagine a future that didn't. Without realizing it, Emily began building her life around assumptions she never questioned. This is forever. This is home. This is the man I'm going to marry. Those beliefs weren't based on fantasy. They were based on evidence, or at least what seemed like evidence at the time. Every shared experience reinforced the same conclusion. Ryan loved her. She loved him. They were building something real, something lasting. And perhaps that's why the warning signs felt so easy to ignore when they first appeared, because they didn't arrive suddenly. They arrived quietly, so quietly that Emily almost missed them. At first, it was little things, conversations about the future that seemed to make Ryan uncomfortable. Whenever discussions moved toward long-term plans, he often redirected them elsewhere. If Emily mentioned buying a home someday, Ryan would joke about needing to survive the present first. If she talked about where they might be in 5 years, he would smile and change the subject. The responses didn't feel alarming individually. Everyone moves at different speeds, everyone thinks about commitment differently. Emily told herself there was no reason to worry, yet the pattern continued. Months passed, then more months. The relationship kept moving forward, but discussions about the future remained strangely vague. At times, Ryan seemed deeply invested. He talked about upcoming vacations, future experiences, things they should do together someday. Other times he seemed distant, almost withdrawn, as though a part of him existed somewhere Emily couldn't reach. There were evenings when he appeared distracted even while sitting beside her. Moments when she sensed something weighing on him but couldn't determine what it was. Whenever she asked if everything was okay, his answer was always the same: "I'm fine." And perhaps he believed it, or perhaps he wanted to believe it. Either way, Emily accepted the explanation, because love often encourages optimism. It encourages patience. It encourages us to explain away the things we don't fully understand. As time went on, the mixed signals became more noticeable. Ryan could be incredibly affectionate one week and emotionally unavailable the next. He spoke about commitment indirectly, while avoiding conversations that required direct answers. Some days, Emily felt closer to him than ever before. Other days, she felt as though she was trying to connect with someone standing just beyond reach. The uncertainty unsettled her, but not enough to challenge the larger story she believed they were living. After all, relationships are complicated. Nobody is emotionally available all the time. Nobody communicates perfectly. Those explanations comforted her, for a while. Then came the conversation Emily would replay for years. The conversation began like dozens of others before it. There was no dramatic argument leading up to it. No obvious warning that this particular evening would divide Emily Carter's life into a before and an after. In fact, if someone had looked at them from a distance, they probably would have assumed everything was normal. Two people sitting together after years of shared memories. Two people who knew each other's habits, favorite foods, family stories, and fears. Two people who had spent 6 years building a relationship that seemed strong enough to survive almost anything. Emily certainly believed it would. That belief is what made what happened next so difficult to understand. Years later, she could still remember details she wished she had forgotten. The way Ryan Brooks avoided eye contact longer than usual. The unusual quietness that settled between them before either spoke. The feeling in her stomach that something wasn't right even before the words arrived. Looking back, she often wondered whether part of her already knew, whether her heart recognized the ending before her mind could accept it. For several minutes, Ryan spoke carefully, choosing each sentence as though he were afraid of saying the wrong thing. At first, Emily struggled to follow his meaning. The conversation felt scattered, incomplete, like pieces of a puzzle missing from the box. She listened closely, waiting for clarity, waiting for the explanation that would make everything make sense. It never came. Instead, Ryan eventually said the sentence that would echo through Emily's life for years afterward. "I don't know if I'm the person you need." The words landed with a strange kind of silence. Not because they were loud, because they weren't. Ryan didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound angry. He sounded sad, and somehow that made it worse. For a moment, Emily simply stared at him. She waited for the rest of the sentence. The explanation, the clarification, the part that would transform confusion into understanding. None arrived. Instead, the silence grew heavier. When people imagine heartbreak, They often picture explosive fights and dramatic confrontations. They imagine slammed doors, accusations, and final declarations. But some of the deepest heartbreaks happen quietly. They arrive in ordinary rooms through ordinary conversations. They arrive in the form of sentences that seem almost gentle until you realize they are dismantling an entire future. Emily's first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. What did he mean he wasn't the person she needed? After 6 years together, how could he suddenly be uncertain about something that once seemed so obvious? Hadn't they already built a life together? Hadn't they spent years planning experiences, sharing dreams, introducing families, and creating memories? What had changed? Most importantly, when had it changed? She asked questions. Ryan answered some of them, but every answer seemed to create even more uncertainty. He talked about feeling lost, about doubts he couldn't fully explain, about struggles he had been carrying privately, about uncertainty regarding his future. The explanations sounded sincere, yet none of them answered the question Emily wanted answered most. Why now? Why after 6 years? Why after all the promises, all the plans, all the moments that seemed to point toward forever? Even Ryan appeared unable to explain it clearly. That became one of the most painful parts of the entire experience. There was no obvious villain, no betrayal she could point to, no shocking revelation, no secret life, no dramatic discovery, just a relationship that somehow slipped through their hands despite all the love that had once existed inside it. Emily desperately searched for certainty during that conversation. She looked for something solid to hold on to, a reason, an explanation, a mistake that could be fixed. But every path led back to the same reality. Ryan was leaving, and nothing she said seemed capable of changing his mind. The disbelief stayed with her long after the conversation ended. For weeks, she replayed every moment in her head. Every trip, every holiday, every conversation, every photograph. She searched for clues hidden inside memories that once felt uncomplicated. Surely there had been signs. Surely she should have noticed something. Surely there was a moment where everything started falling apart. Yet no matter how many times she examined the past, the answers remained frustratingly out of reach. That uncertainty slowly transformed into something even more painful: betrayal. Not because Ryan had been cruel, not because he had lied, but because Emily felt abandoned by a future she had trusted. A future she had spent years believing in. A future that disappeared without warning. The breakup itself happened quickly. The emotional aftermath lasted much longer. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Friends encouraged her to move forward. Family members reminded her she deserved happiness. People repeated familiar phrases. Everything happens for a reason. You'll find someone else. Time heals all wounds. The words were kind. They were well-intentioned. And they were completely incapable of easing the questions that haunted her. Because Emily wasn't simply grieving the loss of Ryan. She was grieving the absence of understanding. There was no closure, no satisfying answer, no final conversation that explained everything, no moment where all the pieces suddenly fit together. Just silence. The kind of silence that invites endless speculation. The kind of silence that convinces you there must be one final conversation waiting somewhere in the future, one final explanation, one final answer, one final chance to make sense of everything. That belief became the thread Emily held on to. At first, she expected Ryan to call. Then she expected him to return. Then she expected time to reveal answers she couldn't yet see. But none of those things happened. Life continued moving forward. Birthdays came and went. Seasons changed. Years passed. And yet part of Emily remained emotionally anchored to that final conversation. Not because she was incapable of moving forward, because she was still searching for meaning, still searching for understanding, still searching for closure. In public, she slowly rebuilt her life. Privately, she continued speaking to Ryan in ways he would never hear. She imagined conversations while driving, rehearsed questions before falling asleep, composed responses to arguments that no longer existed, created explanations on his behalf, debated possibilities, revisited memories, corrected things she wished she had said. In many ways, Ryan remained present long after he was gone, not physically, but emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. The relationship had ended. The conversation had not. Ryan walked away, but Emily never truly stopped talking to him. The first few weeks after Ryan Brooks left were difficult. The first few months were even harder. But what surprised Emily Carter most was what happened after that. Life did not stop. The world did not pause to acknowledge her heartbreak. Charleston remained as beautiful as it had always been. The streets remained busy. The cafes stayed open. Friends continued getting engaged, getting married, having children, and building futures. Seasons changed exactly as they always had. Spring became summer. Summer became fall. Fall became winter. Then the cycle began again. And somehow, despite all that movement, part of Emily remained frozen in the same place. At first, she told herself healing simply required time. Everyone said so. Every article, every friend, every family member seemed to repeat the same advice. Give it time. Time heals everything. Time will make it easier. Emily wanted to believe them. She genuinely did. But as the months passed, she began discovering something many people experience after heartbreak. Time doesn't heal by itself. Time simply creates space. What we do inside that space determines whether healing actually happens. Unfortunately, Emily spent much of that space looking backward. It usually began with something small. A photograph appearing unexpectedly in her phone's memory notifications. A song they used to listen to together. A restaurant they once visited. A street corner that carried an old memory. Each trigger reopened a door she had been trying to close. Before long, she found herself rereading old text messages. Not every day, not even every week, but often enough that it became a habit. At first, she searched for answers. Then she searched for clues. Eventually, she searched for comfort. She would scroll through conversations from years earlier and revisit moments that once made her smile. Ryan's jokes, his observations, his excitement about future plans. The affectionate messages exchanged during happier times. Reading them felt strangely comforting and painful at the same time. Comforting because they reminded her that the relationship had been real. Painful because they reminded her it was gone. Sometimes she revisited places they loved. The waterfront where they spent countless evenings. The coffee shop where they first met. The beach where they watched sunsets together. She would sit quietly and remember. Not intentionally at first. The memories simply arrived on their own. And once they arrived, they were difficult to dismiss. There is something uniquely powerful about places connected to people we once loved. Long after relationships end, those locations continue holding pieces of the stories we left behind. A familiar bench, a favorite restaurant, a quiet stretch of shoreline. They become emotional landmarks, physical reminders of moments that can never be recreated exactly as they were. For Emily, Charleston itself sometimes felt like a memory. Everywhere she looked, there seemed to be evidence of a life she once believed would continue forever. Then there was social media, a modern form of heartbreak few generations before her ever experienced. In another era, losing touch with someone often meant truly losing touch. Today, people can disappear from our lives while remaining visible on our screens. Emily rarely searched for Ryan intentionally. At least that's what she told herself. Yet whenever his name appeared online, she noticed. Whenever a photograph surfaced, she saw it. Whenever mutual friends posted updates, curiosity quietly pulled her closer. The information was never enough to satisfy her questions, yet it was always enough to keep those questions alive. And perhaps that's what made moving on so difficult. Ryan wasn't entirely gone. He existed in fragments, scattered pieces of information, brief glimpses into a life she was no longer part of. Enough to remind her, never enough to provide closure. As months became years, Emily continued carrying conversations inside her mind. Imaginary conversations, future conversations, conversations she hoped might happen someday. She imagined running into Ryan unexpectedly. She imagined sitting across from him one final time. She imagined hearing the explanation she never received. Sometimes she imagined forgiveness. Sometimes reconciliation. Sometimes simply understanding. The details changed. The hope remained. And if you've ever experienced a loss that ended without closure, you probably understand exactly why. Human beings are natural storytellers. We crave conclusions. We search for meaning. We want beginnings, middles, and endings that make sense. When stories end abruptly, our minds often refuse to accept it. We replay events repeatedly. We revisit memories. We search for missing pieces. Because unfinished stories create tension, and nowhere is that tension more powerful than in matters of the heart. That's why heartbreak often lingers longest when there are unanswered questions. Not knowing can be more painful than knowing. Uncertainty leaves room for possibilities. Possibilities leave room for hope. And hope, while beautiful, can sometimes prevent us from accepting reality. Emily didn't understand that yet. She was still waiting, still wondering, still believing there might be one final chapter left to write. Then came the moments that convinced her she might be right. The false hopes, the near reunions, the small interactions that seemed insignificant to everyone, except the person trying desperately not to read meaning into them. The first happened on her birthday, months after the breakup. Long after meaningful communication had stopped, Emily received a text message. It was from Ryan. Simple, brief, polite. Happy birthday. Hope you're doing well. That was all. Most people would view the message as harmless, ordinary, a small act of kindness. For Emily, it felt much larger. Her heart raced the moment she saw his name. Questions immediately followed. Why now? Why reach out? Had he been thinking about her? Did the message mean something more? Of course, none of those questions could be answered from a simple birthday text. But that didn't stop her from wondering. Then there was the phone call. Months later. Unexpected. Completely unplanned. Ryan called regarding a practical matter connected to something they once shared. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Most of it was routine. Nothing emotional. Nothing significant. Yet after hanging up, Emily spent hours replaying every word. The sound of his voice reopened emotions she thought had finally settled. For days afterward, she found herself imagining possibilities she had worked hard to abandon. Maybe this was the beginning of something. Maybe he missed her. Maybe he was reconsidering. Maybe. Hope has a remarkable ability to survive on very little. Then came occasional social media interactions. A reaction. A comment. A brief acknowledgement. Tiny moments that carried enormous weight in Emily's mind. Every interaction seemed to suggest the same thing. The story wasn't over. At least that's what she wanted to believe. Years later, Emily would recognize those moments for what they truly were. Not signs of reconciliation, not evidence of unfinished love, simply two people whose lives had once mattered deeply to one another. Nothing more. But at the time, she interpreted them differently. Because when someone occupies enough space in your heart, even the smallest gesture can feel significant. And so the waiting continued, not actively, not obsessively, but quietly, persistently, beneath the surface of everyday life. Part of Emily remained emotionally connected to a future she still couldn't entirely let go of. Then one afternoon, during what seemed like an ordinary conversation, Emily heard something she never expected, and in that moment, everything changed. The conversation happened on an ordinary afternoon. No dramatic music, no warning, no sign that Emily Carter's life was about to change again. She was having coffee with an old mutual friend when Ryan Brooks's name surfaced naturally in conversation. At first, Emily barely reacted. Over the years, she had become skilled at hiding her emotions whenever Ryan came up. She could smile politely, change the subject, pretend his name no longer carried weight. But this time was different. The friend hesitated, just for a second, then said something that would stay with Emily for the rest of her life. Ryan seems really happy. The sentence sounded harmless, almost encouraging. Emily nodded politely. Then the friend continued speaking, talking casually, unaware that every word felt heavier than the last. Ryan had recently moved. His photography business was thriving. He had been traveling frequently, and according to people close to him, he was building a serious future with someone new. There was even talk of an engagement. The room suddenly felt smaller. Emily couldn't remember the rest of the conversation clearly. Years later, she would struggle to recall specific details from that afternoon. But she remembered the feeling, the sensation of something collapsing inside her. Not dramatically, not visibly, quietly, like a door closing, like a chapter ending, like a future disappearing. For years, Emily had lived with uncertainty, and uncertainty, painful as it was, still left room for hope. Hope that Ryan might come back. Hope that he might eventually explain everything. Hope that their story wasn't truly finished. But now that uncertainty was gone, For the first time since the breakup, reality stood directly in front of her. Ryan wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. He wasn't waiting. He wasn't secretly finding his way back to her. He was building a life, a completely different life. And Emily wasn't part of it. The drive home felt endless. She stared through the windshield, while memories surfaced without permission. The coffee shop where they met, the road trips, the beach walks, the family dinners, the plans, the promises, the future she had once believed belonged to both of them. All of it suddenly felt distant, like a movie she had watched years ago, like a story that belonged to someone else. She arrived home emotionally exhausted, not because she had learned something shocking, but because she had learned something final. There would be no reunion, no surprise phone call, no grand return, no movie ending. The version of the future she had been carrying for years no longer existed, and for the first time, she couldn't pretend otherwise. That night she sat alone in her apartment, long after darkness settled across Charleston. The silence felt different now, not heavier, just clearer. Painful clarity often arrives when hope finally runs out. For years Emily had been grieving the loss of Ryan. Now she was grieving the loss of possibility itself. The possibility that everything might somehow return to the way it once was. The possibility that one conversation could fix everything. The possibility that fate had one final surprise waiting for her. It didn't. And accepting that truth hurt more than the breakup ever had. Because breakups often leave questions. This revelation removed them. The answer had finally arrived. Not the answer Emily wanted, but the answer she needed. Sometimes the hardest truth isn't that someone left, it's realizing they're never coming back. That realization stayed with Emily for days, then weeks. She continued working, continued seeing friends, continued moving through her routine. But internally, something had shifted. The fantasy she had unknowingly protected for years was gone, and without that fantasy, there was nowhere left to place all the emotions she had been carrying. The sadness, the anger, the disappointment, the confusion, the love. All of it remained. Yet there was no longer a future conversation waiting to absorb it. No future reconciliation, no future explanation, only silence. And eventually that silence forced Emily to do something she had avoided for years. She stopped waiting for Ryan to hear her, and decided to hear herself instead. It happened late one evening. The city outside her apartment had grown quiet. Most of Charleston was asleep. Emily sat at her kitchen table unable to rest. Thoughts moved endlessly through her mind. Memories, questions, regrets, words she wished she had spoken, words she wished she had heard. For years she had carried those thoughts everywhere she went. Now they felt too heavy to carry any longer. So she opened a drawer, pulled out a notebook, found a pen, and began writing. At first the words came slowly. A sentence, then another, then a paragraph, then an entire page. Once she started, she couldn't stop. Everything she had spent years holding inside finally found its way onto paper. The hurt, the anger, the gratitude, the love, the disappointment, the dreams, the questions, the memories. Every emotion she had been carrying since Ryan walked away. She wrote about the day they met, the first time she realized she loved him, the future she thought they were building, the confusion she felt when everything ended, the frustration of never receiving answers, the loneliness that followed, the years she spent waiting. Nothing was hidden, nothing was softened, nothing was edited. For perhaps the first time in her life, Emily was completely honest, not with Ryan, with herself. Hours passed unnoticed, pages filled one after another. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she stopped writing and simply stared at the paper. Sometimes she crossed out entire sections before starting again. Certain memories still hurt too much to describe cleanly. Certain truths remained difficult to admit. Yet she continued, sentence after sentence, page after page, until the sky outside her window began changing color. Darkness slowly surrendered to morning. Sunlight crept across the room, and Emily finally placed the pen down. The letter resting in front of her was unlike anything she had ever written. It wasn't short, it wasn't simple, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Years of heartbreak condensed into words, years of silence transformed into honesty, years of waiting finally given a voice. For a long time she simply stared at the pages, reading them, rereading them, absorbing what she had written. Then she carefully folded the letter, placed it inside an envelope, and wrote Ryan Brooks's name across the front. For the first time in years, she felt something that resembled peace. Not complete peace, but enough. Enough to believe she was finally ready. Enough to believe this letter might provide the closure she had spent years searching for. Enough to believe that once Ryan read those words, she could finally let go. When she finished, Emily believed she was finally ready to send it. The letter remained on Emily Carter's kitchen table for 3 days. 3 days. 3 opportunities to place it in the mail. 3 mornings when she could have walked it to a mailbox and finally sent the words she had spent years carrying. Yet every time she picked up the envelope, something stopped her. At first, she assumed it was fear. Fear of Ryan Brooks reading it. Fear of receiving no response. Fear of receiving a response that hurt even more. Those fears seemed reasonable. After all, the letter contained everything. The pain, the disappointment, the unanswered questions, the memories she had spent years trying to outrun. Anyone would feel nervous sending something so personal. So Emily told herself she simply needed more time. One more day, then another, then another. But as those days passed, she found herself doing something unexpected. She began rereading the letter, not once, not twice, again and again. Each time searching for mistakes, searching for sentences she wanted to revise, searching for thoughts she might have expressed differently. Yet the more she reread it, the less interested she became in editing the words. Instead, she became fascinated by what the words revealed. The first time she noticed it, she almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so obvious she couldn't believe she had missed it. Every paragraph seemed to begin with Ryan, and every paragraph somehow ended with her. She went back to the first page, reading more carefully this time. Ryan did this. Ryan said that. Ryan left. Ryan disappeared. Ryan broke her heart. But then the focus shifted, every single time, to what she felt, what she feared, what she lost, what she learned, what she needed. The pattern repeated over and over. At first she thought she was imagining it. Then she kept reading, and the realization grew impossible to ignore. The letter wasn't really about Ryan, not entirely. It never had been. For years, Emily believed she had been writing a letter to the man she loved. Now she wasn't so sure. The discovery unsettled her. Because if the letter wasn't truly about Ryan, then what exactly was it about? That question followed her throughout the week, while making coffee, while answering emails, while lying awake at night. The more she thought about it, the more she understood something she had been unable to see before. The letter contained remarkably few questions. Not because she didn't have questions. She had spent years collecting them. The breakup itself had left countless unanswered mysteries. Yet when she finally sat down to write, those questions barely appeared on the page. Instead, the letter was filled with statements, admissions, confessions, truths, observations, memories. It wasn't demanding explanations. It wasn't asking Ryan to justify his choices. It wasn't begging for closure. It was simply telling the truth. And perhaps that was why the letter felt so powerful. For years, Emily had convinced herself she needed answers from Ryan. Yet when given unlimited space to ask those questions, she spent most of her time writing about herself instead. About her grief, her growth, her heartbreak, her healing, her fears, her resilience. The person occupying the center of the letter wasn't Ryan Brooks. It was Emily Carter. That realization changed everything, because for the first time, Emily began understanding something that had remained hidden beneath all her pain. The letter wasn't an attempt to communicate with Ryan. The letter was an attempt to communicate with herself, to acknowledge what happened, to validate what she felt, to give language to experiences she had spent years carrying silently. The pages weren't asking Ryan to rescue her from heartbreak. They were documenting how she had survived it. As that truth settled in, Emily found herself rereading certain sections differently. Some sentences felt almost like conversations between two versions of herself. The woman who had been abandoned by uncertainty, and the woman who had survived it. The woman who spent years waiting, and the woman beginning to understand she didn't have to wait anymore. For the first time since the breakup, she looked at her pain without immediately looking for Ryan's role inside it. Instead, she examined her own journey, the loneliness, the hope, the disappointment. The endurance, the strength she had overlooked because she was so focused on what she lost. People often assume healing arrives when pain disappears. Emily was beginning to realize something different. Healing arrives when pain finally tells its entire story. And her pain had been trying to tell a story for years. Not a story about Ryan leaving, a story about Emily surviving after he did. One evening she sat alone and read the letter from beginning to end once more, slowly, carefully. This time she paid attention to the emotions hidden between the sentences. She noticed how often gratitude appeared beside heartbreak, how often love appeared beside disappointment, how often forgiveness appeared beside anger. The letter wasn't filled with bitterness. That surprised her. After everything that happened, she expected resentment. Instead, she found compassion. Not only for Ryan, for herself. She saw a woman who had loved deeply, a woman who had hoped sincerely, a woman who had experienced loss and somehow continued moving forward despite it. For years, Emily believed the breakup defined her story. Now she could see it was only one chapter, an important chapter, a painful chapter, but not the entire story. The realization arrived quietly, without fanfare, without some dramatic moment of clarity, simply a growing understanding that spread through her thoughts like sunlight entering a dark room. She didn't need Ryan to read the letter. She needed herself to read it. She didn't need Ryan to acknowledge her pain. She had already acknowledged it. She didn't need Ryan to explain her worth. His inability to stay had never determined her value. And perhaps most importantly, she didn't need Ryan to provide closure, because closure wasn't hiding inside his response. Closure was hiding inside her acceptance. Suddenly, the purpose of the letter became clear. It was never designed to reopen communication. It was designed to end the conversation. Not the conversation between Emily and Ryan, the conversation inside Emily's own mind, the endless replaying, the endless questioning, the endless waiting. The letter wasn't about getting answers. It was about releasing questions. Questions she finally understood might never be answered. Questions she no longer needed answered. Questions she was finally ready to put down. And with that realization came the most important truth of all. For years she thought she needed Ryan to free her. She thought he held the explanation, the closure, the piece, the final piece of the puzzle. But Ryan wasn't holding the key. She was. And for the first time since he walked away, Emily Carter began to understand that the door had never been locked at all. The decision didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic breakthrough, no single moment where Emily Carter suddenly woke up healed. Real healing rarely works that way. Instead, it arrived gradually, like daylight appearing before sunrise, quietly, patiently, almost unnoticed. For several days after her realization, the letter remained exactly where it had been. Folded carefully inside its envelope, Ryan Brooks' name written neatly across the front. The same letter she had spent years unknowingly preparing herself to write. The same letter she once believed would change everything. Now she wasn't so sure. Because every time she looked at it, a new question appeared. Not whether Ryan should read it, whether he needed to. And the answer became clearer each day. No, he didn't. The letter had already done what it was meant to do. It had told the truth. It had carried the weight she could no longer carry alone. It had given a voice to years of silence. Sending it suddenly felt less important than writing it had. That realization lingered throughout the week. Then one morning, before most of Charleston had fully awakened, Emily found herself standing in her apartment holding the envelope. She hadn't planned what came next. She simply knew she needed to leave the apartment. The letter felt different in her hands now, lighter, not because its contents had changed, because she had. For years, Emily had imagined this envelope as a bridge leading back toward Ryan. Now she understood it was leading somewhere else entirely, toward herself, toward acceptance, toward peace. Without fully thinking about it, she slipped on a jacket and stepped outside. The city greeted her with the soft quietness that exists only in the earliest hours of morning. The streets were nearly empty. Storefronts remained dark. The air carried the familiar scent of salt drifting in from the harbor. Emily began walking, not toward a mailbox, not toward Ryan, toward the waterfront, the same waterfront where she and Ryan had spent countless evenings together, the same place that had witnessed some of their happiest moments, the same place she had avoided at times because the memories felt too heavy. Years earlier, standing there beside Ryan, she had imagined a future unfolding before them. Now she stood there alone. And strangely, she no longer felt abandoned. She found a quiet place overlooking the water and sat down. The envelope rested in her lap. For several minutes, she simply stared at it. Thinking, remembering, breathing. There was no anger inside her. That surprised her. For so long she assumed healing would arrive through blame, that she would eventually become furious enough to stop caring. But sitting there by the water, she realized anger had never been what she wanted. She wanted peace. And peace was beginning to feel possible. Emily turned the envelope over slowly. Ryan's name stared back at her. For years that name had represented unfinished business, unanswered questions, unspoken words, lost possibilities. Now it represented something else. A chapter, important, life-changing, painful, beautiful, finished. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to acknowledge a truth she had resisted for years. Ryan had not ruined her life. He had been part of it. A meaningful part, a transformative part, a part she would always remember. But still only a part, not the whole story. Not the ending, not the person responsible for her future. That responsibility belonged to her. The realization filled her with an unexpected sense of gratitude. Not gratitude for the heartbreak, not gratitude for the pain, gratitude for surviving it, for discovering strength she never knew she possessed, for learning that her life could continue even after losing something she once believed she couldn't live without, for learning that closure isn't always something we receive. Sometimes it's something we create. The wind moved gently across the water. The morning sun climbed higher, and Emily finally made her choice. Carefully, she opened the envelope. She removed the letter. Page by page, line by line, every memory, every confession, every question, every truth. The pages that had carried years of longing rested quietly in her hands. Then she did something she never imagined she would do. She folded the letter one final time. Not to mail it, not to save it for later, but to place it inside a small keepsake box she had brought with her, the same wooden box that had sat beneath her bed for years, the same box that had quietly protected her memories while she searched for answers. This time, however, the meaning was different. She wasn't hiding the letter. She wasn't preserving hope. She wasn't waiting for a better moment. She was honoring the journey. There are some stories that deserve remembrance even after they end. Some chapters deserve a place in our lives without controlling them. The letter belonged to her past, and that was okay. Not everything from the past needs to be erased. Some things simply need to be put in their proper place. As Emily closed the lid of the box, something inside her settled. No dramatic rush of emotion, no overwhelming release, just a quiet sense of completion, like reaching the final page of a book you've carried for years. The story was still meaningful. It simply wasn't unfinished anymore. Because letting go is often misunderstood. People imagine it means forgetting, pretending something never mattered, pretending someone never mattered. But Emily's experience taught her something different. Letting go isn't rejection. It isn't bitterness. It isn't denying the love that once existed. It's accepting that some people belong to our story without belonging to our future. It's carrying the lessons forward without carrying the pain. It's remembering without remaining trapped. It's loving what was while making room for what can be. As she stood and prepared to leave the waterfront, Emily glanced once more at the box in her hands. For a moment, she thought about the woman who had written the letter. The woman who stayed awake all night, pouring years of heartbreak onto paper. The woman who believed Ryan's response might save her. The woman who thought closure lived somewhere outside herself. That woman felt familiar, yet distant. Because standing there now was someone different, someone stronger, someone freer, someone who finally understood. The story began with a letter resting beside a cold cup of coffee. An envelope opened and closed countless times. A woman unable to let go. Now the same letter sat quietly inside a wooden box. The same envelope, the same words, the same memories. But a completely different woman held them. And for the first time in years, Emily Carter walked away without looking back. The most remarkable part of Emily Carter's story wasn't the heartbreak. It wasn't the breakup. It wasn't even the letter. The most remarkable part was what happened afterward. Because life has a way of surprising us when we finally stop standing still. For years, Emily measured time differently. Birthdays weren't simply birthdays. Holidays weren't simply holidays. Every season carried an invisible question. Would this be the year Ryan Brooks came back? Would this be the year she finally received answers? Would this be the year everything made sense? Without realizing it, she had spent years organizing parts of her future around a possibility that no longer existed. Now that possibility was gone, and strangely, so was the weight she had been carrying. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, the way winter slowly surrenders to spring. Months passed after the morning at the waterfront. The wooden box remained safely stored away. The letter remained inside it, untouched, not because Emily was afraid to read it again, because she no longer needed to. Its purpose had been fulfilled. The words had already done their work. And for the first time in years, Emily noticed something unexpected. She was thinking about Ryan less. Not intentionally, not through effort. It simply happened. Entire days passed without his name entering her mind. Then weeks. When memories surfaced, they no longer arrived with the same sharp ache. They felt softer, distant, like photographs from another chapter of life. Still meaningful, just no longer painful. That change created space, and once the waiting disappeared, Emily discovered how much of herself had been hidden beneath it. She started saying yes to things she would have declined before. Weekend trips, last-minute invitations, new experiences, new conversations, new people. Not because she was trying to replace Ryan, because she was finally reconnecting with herself. One spring, she booked a solo trip she had postponed for years. There was no special occasion, no dramatic reason. She simply wanted to go. Years earlier, she would have wished she had someone beside her. Now she found herself appreciating the freedom. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't comparing the present to an imagined future. She was actually living in it. And something surprising happened. Joy returned. Not the overwhelming excitement of new romance, not the temporary happiness that depends on circumstances. A quieter joy, the kind that grows from peace, the kind that arrives when you're no longer fighting reality. Emily began rediscovering interests she had neglected. Books, photography, long walks, writing, friendships that deserved more attention than she had given them. She spent more time with family, more time laughing, more time being fully present. People around her noticed the difference before she did. Friends commented that she seemed lighter, more relaxed, more herself. At first, Emily dismissed those observations. Then she realized they were right. For years, she had been emotionally living in two places at once. Part of her existed in the present, part of her remained trapped in the past. Now both parts had finally reunited, and that's when genuine healing began. Interestingly, the future did bring new people into Emily's life. New friendships formed naturally. Meaningful connections appeared where she least expected them. There was even one person who made her smile in ways she hadn't smiled for a very long time. A kind man, patient, thoughtful, someone who enjoyed conversations that lasted for hours, someone who listened carefully, someone who never tried to become the center of her healing journey. But this story isn't about him, because healing isn't most powerful when someone new arrives. Healing is most powerful when someone new arrives and you realize you were already okay before they did. That was Emily's victory. She no longer needed another person to rescue her from loneliness. She no longer needed another person to validate her worth. She no longer needed another person to provide closure. For the first time in her adult life, she understood that her happiness belonged to her, and nobody could take that away. Looking back, Emily eventually reached a surprising conclusion about Ryan Brooks. She no longer viewed him as the man who broke her heart, nor did she view him as the man who got away. He became something much simpler, a chapter, an important chapter, a meaningful chapter, a chapter that taught her lessons she might never have learned otherwise, lessons about love, about grief, about hope, about resilience, about herself, and perhaps that's why she eventually stopped asking why their relationship ended. The question no longer mattered, not because she had all the answers, because she had something more valuable than answers: acceptance. The love story didn't end when Ryan left. The real love story began when Emily chose herself. And maybe that's the part of the story that matters most. Because somewhere, someone listening right now, maybe carrying their own version of Emily's letter. Maybe not on paper, maybe in memory, maybe in unanswered questions, maybe in a conversation they wish had gone differently, maybe in a goodbye they never received, maybe in a person they still think about when the world grows quiet. If that's you, consider this. Closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's a decision to stop waiting, a decision to stop replaying, a decision to stop placing your future in the hands of someone who no longer lives there. For years, Emily believed peace existed on the other side of Ryan's response. What she discovered was far more profound. Peace existed on the other side of her own acceptance. As the years continued moving forward, Charleston remained beautiful. The ocean still met the horizon every evening. The same waterfront still welcomed early morning walkers. The same streets still carried memories. But the woman walking those streets had changed. Emily Carter no longer searched for signs, no longer waited for explanations, no longer measured her life by what might have been. She measured it by what was, and what was turned out to be enough, more than enough, because happiness doesn't always arrive through finding the person you thought you lost. Sometimes it arrives through finding the person you forgot while searching for them, yourself. Have you ever waited for closure that never came? Would you have sent the letter? Do you believe healing requires answers? Let us know in the comments below. We genuinely love to hear your thoughts and experiences, and if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true-to-life stories about love, heartbreak, healing, second chances, resilience, and the courage to keep moving forward when life doesn't unfold the way we expected. Because every story we share is ultimately about something deeper than romance. It's about being human. And remember, not every letter is meant to be sent. Some are meant to set you free.